بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين وبعد. Continuing on with our second lesson on قواعد الإعراب or الإعراب عن قواعد الإعراب, Ibn Hisham's famous book on the discussions of إعراب. Now he begins with the first chapter. He says الباب الأول في الجملة وأحكامها وفيه أربع مسائل. Ibn Hisham is very organized, and you'll find this theme in a lot of his books, and perhaps each and every single one of his books. He will discuss this, or he will bring his discussions in a very organized manner, and perhaps in every chapter he's going to mention a number of masail to make things easy for you to understand. So الباب الأول في الجملة وأحكامها. The first chapter is regarding the sentence, the complete sentence, and its rules. وفيه أربع مسائل, and this has 4 discussions within it. Now, number 1, what is the word al-awwalu? This does not actually pertain to i'rab, but we're mentioning this because of the fact that you will come across this word quite a bit, so it's good to understand the nature of this word right now. Al-awwalu is naqidul akhir, not akhar. Right? Akhar means another. Akhir means the last. So awwal is the opposite of the last, meaning al-awwal means first. Okay. Asluhu aw'alu. The word is actually aw'alu. Ala wazni, on the pattern of af'al. فَقُلِبَتِ الْهَمْزَةُ الثَّانِيَةُ وَاوًا. The second hamza turned into a waw, hence it became awwalu. ثُمَّ أُدْغِمَتِ الْواو فِي الْواو. And then we had idgham, hence it being awwalu. Okay. وَقِيل, and others say, asluhu, this word is actually waw'alun. فَقُلِبَتِ الْواو الْأُولَى hamza. This first waw in waw'alun changed into a hamza. ثُمَّ قُلِبَتِ الْهَمْزَةُ الثَّانِيَةُ وَاوًا. Then the hamza in waw'alun, that hamza over there changed into a waw. Hence it became aw. Remember, the first waw changed into an hamza. It became awwalun. And then because you had 2 waws back to back, idgham occurred. And hence it became awwalu. Now, do we pronounce this as awwalu or do we pronounce this as awwalun? Alright. He explains over here exactly when it is pronounced as awwalu and when it is pronounced as awwalun. He says, وَلَوْ اسْتِعْمَالًا أحدهما أن يكون اسما بمعنى قبل. It can be an ism in the meaning of قبل. فحينئذ يكون منصرفا منونا. In this scenario, if it's an ism in the meaning of قبل, it will be منصرف and it will receive a tanween. ومنه قولهم أولا وآخرا. الحمد لله أولا وآخرا. If you're wondering why does أولا over there receive a tanween, it's because it's in the meaning of قبل, in the beginning and in the end. والثاني أن يكون صفة أي أفعل التفضيل بمعنى الأسبق. It can be a word in the meaning of the first. It's on the pattern of af'al. It's in the meaning of af'al. It's being used to show the first to come. In that scenario, فيكون غير منصرف. It will be غير منصرف. Why? لوزن الفعل والوصف. Because af'al has, number 1, the quality of صفة. It is equality. And the second quality, the second cause from the 9 that goes along with wasf, in this scenario would be وزن الفعل. Okay. Now, why mention this first? Why mention باب الجملة وأحكامها first? He says وإنما قدم هذا على سائر الأبواب. Kafiyji writes that the reason he brought this first is because the purpose of the book is to teach i'rab. And obviously by learning the i'rab of jumal, of sentences, you learn i'rab to a degree. Number 1. Number 2, the i'rab that's taught here is not the i'rab you normally learn in books of nahwu. Because books of nahwu primarily deal with i'rab of structures within a sentence, but not with regards to i'rab of sentences themselves. You will find this incorporated in certain books of Nahwu. But as a chapter of itself, of its own, this you might not find in all books of Nahwu. Which is why Ibn Hisham is bringing this over here. Is فيه بيان إعراب محل الجمل. This chapter will teach you the i'rab of the placement of jumal. Alright? Placement over here, mahal, you can translate as state, you can translate as placement, as long as you understand the concept itself. What is mahal versus what is lafz versus taqdir. That's sufficient. And that we'll cover later, bi'idhnillah. Okay? Doing i'rab of a mudaf ilayh is very easy, but understanding how a whole sentence is playing a role in a paragraph is much more difficult. For that reason, he mentioned this first, the i'rab of this. And again, the book is essentially, you're learning i'rab as a science of its own. So in this book, he's not going to teach you ta'rif al-kalima, because that's taught in the books of Nahwu. But what's not taught in all books of Nahwu, or in many books of Nahwu, is i'rab al-jumal. Hence the reason for him discussing this. Now, before he discusses the Arab of Jumal, he's going to mention to you the different types of sentences. And he's going to mention to you what is a Jumla. So, al-mas'alatul ula fi sharhiya. The first discussion revolves around the meaning of a Jumla. So he says, اعلم أن اللفظ المركب المفيد. Now, in certain editions, you might not find the lafz al-murakkab. That's fine. اعلم أن اللفظ المفيد يسمى كلاما وجملة. The beneficial statement. Now, why am I translating a lafz as statement? If murakkab is there, it's fine. You can translate it as statement. Number one. Number two, if you say al-lafz al-mufid, the meaning of mufid over here is ما يحسن السكوت عليه. It gives a meaning upon which silence is appropriate. That needs to be a complete statement, and that can't be found within one word. If I say, for instance, Muhammad, or if I say cat, you understand a benefit from cat. You understand the meaning of cat, but it's not a complete benefit. And the grammarians, when they refer to a benefit, al-lafz al-murakkab al-mufid, they're referring to a complete benefit, i.e. the subject and predicate has been mentioned. The musnad ilay and the musnad has been mentioned. That's what they understand to be a complete benefit. So he says al-lafz al-mufid, that already entails, even if you don't assume murakkab to be there, that already entails that the structure is a compound structure and there is a musnad ilay and a musnad within it. Al-lafz al-murakkab al-mufid. Al-lafz al-mufid yusamma kalaman. It can be called a kalam wa jumla, and it can also be called a jumla. Now, what does al-mufid mean? He says, وَنَعْنِي بِالْمُفِيدِ مَا يَحْسُنُ السُّكُوتُ عَلَيْهِ. That upon which silence is appropriate. Why is he specifying this? Because al-mufid can have different meanings. Al-mufid linguistically can mean mutlaq al-ifada, like any type of benefit. Now, if someone says, for instance, cat, just says cat, yeah, qittun. All right. This is mufid because you understand the meaning of cat. But this is not the benefit the grammarians are looking for. The grammarians are looking for a benefit in which you have a subject and a predicate. You have isnad, you have musnad ilayna musnad. So the grammarians, when they say al-mufid, they don't intend mutlaq al-ifada. Okay. It's also possible that al-mufid refers to fa'idatun jadida. It gives a new benefit. Why? Because if you think about certain structures, there might be a musnad ilayna musnad, but they're not actually giving you new information. Like Ibn Malik and others, they add a condition for a kalam to be a kalam. They say it has to give you a new benefit. If you say as-sama'u fawqana, well, we can see that. We already know that. Al-ardu tahtana, we already know that. So it's not giving any new benefit. So they would say that's not a kalam. Understood? On account of the fact that for them, al-mufid means al-mufidu fa'idatan jadida. It gives you new information. And we've discussed this in detail in Mutammima. And the first 5 videos of Mutammima, you'll find them online on YouTube. Or on our Talwih Academy as well. You can refer back to them and you'll find over there Abu Hayyan and others how they reply to Ibn Malik. And they say that fa'idatun jadida, for a sentence to give a new benefit, that's not necessarily a condition. Okay? It's still a sentence according to the grammarians. Number 3, fa'ida can mean al-fa'idatu tamma, a complete benefit. And this is what the grammarians refer to. Al-fa'idatu tamma means ma yahsunu sukutu alayhi. There's a musnad ilayna musnad. You've brought a subject and you've given information regarding that subject. That's what they're referring to. So to specify that, Ibn Hisham writes, وَنَعْنِي بِالْمُفِيد. When we say mufid, we don't intend mutlaq al-ifada. We don't intend fa'idatun jadida. We intend al-fa'idatu tamma. And what is al-fa'idatu tamma? Ma yahsunu sukutu alayhi. It is appropriate for the speaker to observe silence over this. Now, why for the speaker? Because they have a khilaf. When we say it's appropriate to observe silence over this, does it refer to al-mutakallim, the speaker? Meaning when I say this, it's right for me to observe silence over this. Does it refer to the sami', the person who's listening? He can observe silence over this, Or does it refer to kilahuma, both of them? Both of us can refer to, it's appropriate for both of us to remain silent over this. All right. Over here, the grammarians, they say the stronger opinion is al-mutakallim. Why? I'll give you an example. So you walk into a room and you see Zayd bleeding. Or you see like Zayd, like, he got hurt really bad. What's the first thing you're thinking? You're thinking, well, who hit Zayd? And someone looks and says, Duriba Zaydun, Zayd was hit. Now, you as the audience, you as the listener, you're thinking, I don't care. I know Zayd's hit. I want to know who hit him. So over here, technically speaking, like you would actually say come out and say like, well, who hit him? So for you as the audience, لا يحسن السكوت عليه. It's not actually appropriate for you to observe silence over this, in the sense that you're not looking for that piece of information that was conveyed to you. You're looking for who the hitter was. And by the speaker saying Duriba Zayd, you're not getting any information of importance. Okay? If we say it's the mutakallim, the speaker is the one based on whom we determine when يحسن السكوت عليه, silence is appropriate, that as long as the speaker brings a musnad ilay and a musnad, technically speaking, he's conveyed a full meaning. And because he's conveyed a full meaning, we say يحسن السكوت عليه, and for that reason, we have a jumla and a kalam. Alright, اللفظ المركب المفيد is referred to as a kalam and jumla. By mufid, we refer to ما يحسن السكوت عليه. I mentioned to you that under mufid, we have three different discussions. Is it مطلق الإفادة? That's clearly not the case. Is it فائدة جديدة, as mentioned by Ibn Malik and others? That's also incorrect according to Ibn Hisham. Is الفائدة التامة, and the meaning of الفائدة التامة is ما يحسن السكوت عليه. Well, ما يحسن السكوت عليه, we have further khilaf. Is it سكوت المتكلم? Is it سكوت السامع? Or is it سكوت كليهما? In that scenario, we say the correct opinion is سكوت المتكلم. And what's intended over here is as soon as you mention a musnad ilay and a musnad, that is sufficient. Why are we saying this? As soon as you mention a musnad ilay and a musnad, that's sufficient. Because someone might say, for instance, ضرب زيد. Now in this case, someone says ضرب زيد. And let's assume, for instance, you know Zayd hit. But you were wondering, who did Zayd hit? Why did I put an alif there? Naam. ضرب Zayd. You know Zayd hit, but you're wondering, who did Zayd hit? Do you want a maf'ul bihi? So you're waiting for the maf'ul bihi to be mentioned. Now, will we say this is a kalam? The answer is yes. Majority of grammarians will say this is a kalam, because when they say ma yahsunu sukutu alay, all they want over there is the presence of a musnad ilay and a musnad. They don't actually care if it gives you new information or not. Because we said we don't want faidah jadida, right? That was Ibn Malik's opinion. They don't actually care if you're still waiting for further information. All they care about when they say ma yahsunu sukutu alay is that it conveys a full meaning in so as much as there is a musnad ilay and a musnad. There is a subject and a predicate. And in daraba zayd, that is found. And that's why they say, for instance, let's assume this was a jumla. The fi'l, for instance, daraba was mabni lil majhul. It wasn't al-mabni lil ma'ruf or mabni lil fa'il. It was al-mabni lil majhul. So you say, for instance, duriba zayd. Now you don't know the hitter. You're wondering who the hitter is. But everyone agrees this is a full sentence. Why? Because there is a musnad ilay and a musnad. Alright, and that's what they're looking for when they say ما يحسن السكوت عليه. This is mentioned in detail by Kafiyaji, and Attar has a lengthy discussion on this. نعم. الكافيجي has an interesting discussion. He says والمراد من حسن سكوت المتكلم على اللفظ المفيد ألا يكون ذلك اللفظ محتاجا في إفادته للسامع كاحتياج المحكوم عليه إلى المحكوم به. This is what I mentioned, that as long as there is a musnad ilay and a musnad, that's sufficient. فلا يضر احتياجه إلى المتعلقات من المفاعيل. The text should be من المفاعيل. It doesn't need further details, which are the fadalat, which are, for instance, the maf'ul bihi, the maf'ul ma'ahu, the jar majur. When we say يحسن السكوت عليه, is there a musnad ilay and a musnad? That's sufficient. Okay. All right. Now, he's mentioned to you that both a jumla, or a better way to do this is, we say that both اللفظ المركب المفيد. In fact, we'll change اللفظ for the word القول. Alright, based on what we mentioned in تميمة. Alright, القول المركب المفيد. This can be applied to or be said upon a kalam, and it can be said upon a jumla. Is there a difference between the two? We said if you have al-qawl al-murakkab al-mufid, you can say that's a jumla, and you can also say that's a kalam. But is there a difference between kalam and jumla, or are they the same? So this is where majority of grammarians will tell you that no, there is a difference. What is the difference? Jumla is simply al-qawl al-murakkab. Okay. Kalam is al-qawl al-murakkab al-mufid. Now, what does al-qawl al-murakkab mean? Murakkab over here, tarkib over here refers to at-tarkib al-isnadi. There is a musnad ilay and a musnad. Anytime you have a musnad ilay and you have a musnad, you have al-qawl al-murakkab, and therefore you have a jumla, right? Does that mean you have a kalam? Not necessarily. Why? Let's look at an example. ضربت زيدا, or ضربت زيدا. You hit Zayd. Over here, this is a jumla. Why is it a jumla? Because isnad of darb has been done to the ta pronoun. So isnad is found. And likewise, it's also a kalam. Why is it a kalam? Because al-mufid is also found. Al-mufid is also found because it's giving a full meaning. So this is a kalam as well. Awesome. But what if I say in darabta zaydan? If you hit Zayd. And I stop over there. Or I just look at darabta zaydan from the structure in darabta zayda. Is that a kalam? And is it a jumla? So as far as it being a jumla is concerned, we have a musnad and we have a musnad ilay. Because we have a musnad and a musnad ilay, we say that structure, darabta zaydan from in darabta zayda, is a jumla. Because what did we tell you? According to a majority of grammarians, a jumla is a tarkib al-isnadi. There is a musnad ilay and a musnad. Done. But is it a kalam? And someone says to you, in darabta zayda, if you hit Zayd. Okay, well what? So the mutakallim himself still has to give further information. In darabta zayda, darabtuk. If you hit Zayd, I will hit you. Darabta zayda has a musnad ilay and it has a musnad. But it is not a kalam because there's no ifada. Right? لا يحسن السكوت عليه. At this point, when you say in darabta zayda, or you look at darabta zayda alone from the structure, in darabta zaydan, darabtuk, you take darabta zaydan alone. That structure being looked at in and of itself is not giving you a full benefit upon which silence is appropriate. And for this reason, we would say this is not a kalam. Just this structure would not be a kalam until you add on in darabta zaydan darabtuk. So notice isnad is found, and therefore we can say it is a jumla. But kalam is not found. He says, وَأَنَّ الْجُمْلَةَ أَعَمُّ مِنَ الْكَلَامِ فَكُلُّ كَلَامٍ جُمْلَةٍ وَلَا يَنْعَكِسْ. Alright, what does this mean over here? So, what is al-jumla? Al-jumla is, number one, you have al-qawl. This is the most broadest, alright, structure. Then you have al-murakkab, ay tarkib al-isnadi. This is the second level. And then finally, along with al-qawl and al-murakkab, afwan, you're going to have al-mufid, third level. I'll make this red. Okay. Al-qawl is the broadest of all these categories. Why? Because al-qawl includes, al-qawl over here will include, for instance, al-mufrad, and it's also going to include al-murakkab. Going to include all these things, right? And when we say al-murakkab, we have specified qawl to a degree. Al-qawl al-murakkab, we specified it to a degree. So now mufrad is no longer intended. And because al-qawl al-murakkab has been specified and isnad is found, isnad of A to B, now we have a sentence. This will be a jumla. Okay. Al-mufid is even more specified. It's not just al-qawl al-murakkab, سواء أفاد فائدة تامة أو لا. It's al-qawl al-murakkab الذي يفيد فائدة تامة. So it's even more specified. And because it's even more specified, every time you have kalam, what is kalam? Al-kalam is al-qawl al-murakkab al-mufid. Naam. So every time you have kalam, because it's more specific, jumla must also be found as well. But on the other hand, you might have a jumla, but you will not have kalam. When will you have a jumla but not kalam? If you have isnad of A to B, you have a jumla. But you might not have kalam if it doesn't give a complete beneficial meaning. This is what he says. وَأَنَّ الْجُمْلَةَ أَعَمُّ مِنَ الْكَلَامِ. Every time you have kalam. What is al-kalam? Al-qawl al-murakkab al-mufid. You have two conditions. There has to be tarkib, and it has to give a full benefit. And Al-Jumla, you only have one condition. It just has to be murakkab. Ay tarkib isnadi. So Jumla, you'll find it's more specific. Or afwan, it's more broad. You'll find it being applied in areas where kalam is not applied. But every time kalam is applied, Jumla must be applied as well. وأن الجملة أعم من الكلام فكل كلام جملة. Every kalam will be a jumla. Because kalam, on account of being al-murakkab, al-mufid, will be inclusive of jumla. ولا ينعكس, but not the opposite. Because jumla is merely al-qawl al-murakkab. It may be mufid, in which case it's a kalam, or it may not be mufid, in which case it's simply a jumla. Like in our example, ضربت زيدا, from the statement in ضربت زيدا. Okay. Based on this, Ibn Hisham now goes into another discussion, which he mentions in the Mughni. He says, based on this, you have now understood that jumla does not equal kalam, and kalam does not equal jumla. Why is he mentioning this? Because certain grammarians, apparently, it would seem that kalam is the exact same as jumla, and jumla is the exact same as kalam. Now, this is attributed to Sahib al-Mufassal. Who is Sahib al-Mufassal? Al-Mufassal is a book authored by Az-Zamakhshari with regards to the science of Nahw and I'rab. And it's a beautiful book. And Ibn al-Hajib, his Kafi, is actually extracted from Al-Mufassal. It's like I guess you could say, refined version of Al-Mufassal with Ibn al-Hajib's touch. Now, his statement, people apparently understood from it that he believes kalam is the exact same thing as jumla, because he defined kalam and then he said, وَيُسَمَّى jumla, it's also called a jumla. So they understood from this that the definition applicable to kalam, according to Ibn al-Hajj, according to Zamakhshari, is equally applicable to jumla as well. Now, is this true? Is that what Zamakhshari intended? It's a long discussion. It is a long discussion. But what they're saying over here is that Zamakhshari understood that al-kalam and al-jumla, they both refer to al-qawlul murakkab al-mufid. Let's assume this is opinion number one. All right. Opinion number two would be that al-kalam and al-jumla, they both refer to al-qawl al-murakkab. So notice they're still synonyms. All right, there's no difference between the two, but now we've actually taken out the clause of al-mufid. So according to this, every kalam would be a jumla and every jumla would be a kalam, but we're not including the clause of al-mufid. A kalam doesn't actually have to give a full meaning, a full benefit. So in ضربت زيدا is a kalam, according to the second opinion, which is mentioned by some grammarians. Then you have Ibn Hisham's opinion that no, there's a difference between the two. And so therefore, they're not synonyms anymore, right? So, al-jumla is a'ammu min al-kalam. You'll find areas where you can refer to it as a jumla, but you can't refer to it as a kalam. And then you have a fourth opinion, which is mentioned by al-Radi, which is the opposite, that al-kalamu a'ammu min al-jumla. You'll have places where you can refer to something as kalam, but you can't refer to it as a jumla. Okay. Now, the first step is to determine, are these actually differing opinions or not? Long discussion. For now, we can just take for granted at this level that the majority opinion is that what Ibn Hisham is mentioning, that al-jumla a'ammu min al-kalam. Right? Jumla is more broad than kalam, because al-jumla is al-qawl al-murakkab and al-kalam is al-qawl al-murakkab al-mufid, and there is a difference between the two. Now, based on this, we can add on, and we'll read the author's discussion in a minute. But based on this, we can also say, as mentioned by Al-Kafiyaji, that al-jumalu ghayru al-mustaqillati bi nafsiha, those sentences which are part of bigger sentences, such as sentences becoming al-sila, sentences becoming a hal, sentences becoming al-sifa, sentences becoming a khabar. These sentences are not actually a kalam. They can be referred to as jumla. So, for instance, you say, جاء الذي يدرس, the person who studies came. So, يدرس is a jumla, because we have a musnad ilayna musnad, right? It's being attributed to the huwa damir. but it is not a kalam. Why is it not a kalam? It's not a kalam because on account of it being part of a bigger sentence, you won't actually understand the entire meaning unless you have that entire sentence. جاء الذي يدرس. You won't understand the entire meaning of this only by looking at يدرس alone. So it's not مفيد فائدة تامة. Okay. وهو إفهام معنى يحسن السكوت عليه. Likewise, جاء زيد يمشي. Okay, or جاء زيد. نعم, جاء زيد يمشي. This is becoming حال. يمشي is becoming حال from Zayd. Once again, this is a jumla. Yamshi is a jumla, but it's not a kalam because it's not giving فائدة يحسن السكوت عليه on account of it being part of a bigger sentence. Or جاء رجل يسعى. Alright, and you'll find this answer within, or this example within the Qur'an. جاء رجل يسعى over here is not giving an example of a complete sentence. It's not a kalam on account of the fact that it doesn't give a meaning upon which silence is appropriate because of the fact that it's playing a role in a bigger sentence. And likewise, Zaydun yaji, the structure yaji, alright, is a jumla. We have isnad, but it's not a kalam on account of the fact that, on account of it being part of a bigger sentence, لا يفيد معنى يحسن السكوت عليه. Alright, and this is mentioned by Al-Kafiyaji and others as well, that for a sentence to be a kalam, it needs to give a complete meaning, and therefore any sentence playing a role in a bigger sentence cannot be giving a complete meaning. And now these are just simple examples, other examples of scenarios where you have jumla occurring but you don't have kalam occurring. Okay, now let's see what the author says. ألا ترى أن نحو إن قام زيد من قولك إن قام زيد قام عمر يسمى جملة ولا يسمى كلاما. Do you not see that your statement إن قام زيد from a larger statement, from your larger statement إن قام زيد قام عمر, if Zayd stands, Amr will stand. يسمى جملة, the structure قام زيد is called a jumla. Why? Because there's isnad. Qiyam, isnad of qiyam has been done to Zayd. ولا يسمى كلاما, but it's not called a kalam. لأنه لا يحسن السكوت عليه, because silence upon this is not appropriate. You say simply, if you take out qama Zayd simply from in qama Zayd and qama Amrun, you are still waiting. You are still waiting to hear something beyond that. Al-Kafiyaji writes, لأنه لفظ مركب, tarkib is found, isnad is found, therefore qama Zayd is a jumla. But it is not a kalam. لا يسمى كلاما. Why? لأنه لا يحسن السكوت عليه. It's not appropriate to observe silence over it. لأن إن الشرطية, because the in, which is a particle of conditioning, أخرجته عن صلاحية السكوت. It's removed from it the ability, or it's removed from it the ability to observe silence over it. والكلام هو القول الذي يحسن السكوت عليه. And kalam is that statement upon which silence is appropriate. And qama Zayd, from in qama Zayd, okay, silence is not appropriate upon that. I've explained this. It's very simple. Just you might not have this insertion of in certain nusakh, and that would make more sense because we're not talking about in qama Zayd. We're simply talking about qama Zayd alone. Okay, وكذا القول في جملة الجواب. And likewise, you would say with regards to جملة الجواب, قام عمر. If you look at قام عمر alone, it's not a full sentence. Now over here there is a khilaf of the certain grammarians. We'll leave that for now. Just understand that whenever you have isnad, tarkib isnadi, according to Ibn Hisham and majority of grammarians, you'd call that a jumla. And for kalam, you need another condition that along with tarkib isnadi, ifada, and by ifada we mean faidatun yahsunu sukutu alayha, is also found. Alright, that was the first breakdown. Or that wasn't a breakdown, in fact. That was the first discussion regarding the meaning of Jumlah and Kalam. Then he said, ثم الجملة تسمى اسمية إن بدأت باسم كزيد قائم وإن زيد قائم وهل زيد قائم وما زيد قائم ولا زيد قائم. وفعلية إن بدأت بفعل كقام زيد وهل قام زيد وزيدا ضربته ويا عبد الله لأن التقدير ضربت زيدا ضربته وأدعو عبد الله. Okay. He says if the sentence begins, if the Jumlah begins with an ism, again, what does begin mean over here? Begin means الصدور. مرادنا بصدر الجملة المسند أو المسند إليه. Alright. If you have a harf coming before the musnad إليه or the musnad, it's irrelevant. So over here, in إن زيد قائم, is this a jumla ismiyyah or jumla fi'liyah? We would say this is still a jumla ismiyyah because the harf coming before Zayd in this scenario is irrelevant because the musnad, when you say it begins with an ism, we're saying the first of the musnad إليه or musnad happens to be an ism. Over here, the musnad إليه, which is coming first, is an ism. So زيد قائم is جملة اسمية. إن زيد قائم is جملة اسمية. هل زيد قائم is جملة اسمية. ما زيد قائمة is also جملة اسمية. لا زيد قائم with emphasis is also جملة اسمية. وفعلية and it will be considered a جملة فعلية in بدأت بفعل if it begins with a verb such as قام زيد. Now that's simple. But likewise, even if a harf was to come before that verb, it would still be referred to as a جملة فعلية such as هل قام زيد. وزيدا ضربته. Now over here you might think to yourself, well clearly an ism is coming first. But زيدا ضربته is really in the power of ضربت زيدا ضربته. This is اشتغال, right? Because the upcoming ضربته is occupied. It's not capable of governing Zayd because it's busy governing the pronoun referring to Zayd. And therefore, we'd have to assume a ضربته prior to Zayd. This is referred to as الاشتغال, or it's also referred to as الإضمار على شريطة التفسير. ويا عبد الله, Ya is a harf and Abd is an ism. So shouldn't it be a جملة اسمية? He says no. This will be a جملة فعلية on account of the fact that Ya is in the place of أدعو. And أدعو is a fi'al. Alright. That is very simple and it's very easy to understand. What if you have a sentence starting with an ism al-fi'l? Is that a jumla ismiya or a jumla fi'liya? Right? We say that's a jumla ismiya. Why is it a jumla ismiya? Because at the end of the day, an ism al-fi'l is an ism. And likewise, أقائم الزيدان, الزيد أخوك, ولعل أباك منطلق, ما زيد قائمة, all of these are jumla ismiya. And on the other hand, أقام زيد, إن قام زيد, وقد قام زيد, وهلا قمت, these are all jumla fi'liya. Alright. When we say it's coming in the beginning, that whether an ism comes in the beginning or a fi'l comes in the beginning, what we're referring to is the placement. Now, what do I mean by placement? Oftentimes, you have details of the verb coming before the verb itself. فَأَيَّ آيَاتِ اللَّهِ تُنْكِرُونَ. تُنْكِرُونَ is the verb. That's the musnad and the musnad ilayh. أَيَّ is the maf'ul bihi of the upcoming تُنْكِرُونَ. So, someone's going to say, well, an ism is coming first. No, it's still jumla fi'liya. Because this is actually in the power of something coming later on. فَفَرِيقًا كَذَّبْتُمْ وَفَرِيقًا تَقْتُلُونَ. Once again, the maf'ul bihi of the upcoming كَذَّبْتُمْ, we still say this is jumla fi'liya because it's in the power of something coming later on, on account of the fact that the placement of the fi'l is before that of the maf'ul bihi and the jar majrur, etc. Okay. He mentions a few more examples, but we'll continue over here. There will be certain scenarios where it's possible for the sentence to be a jumla ismiya or a fi'liya. Now, I want you to think of an example of this. Right? We covered it in the previous lesson. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Because over there you can assume an ism and you can also assume a fi'l. If you assume a fi'l, we'll say it's a jumla fi'liya. If you assume an ism, we will say it's a jumla ismiya. Alright. Such as afid dari Zayd. Is Zayd in the house? And a'indaka Amran. This will leave for a bit. There's a bit more detail over here. ومنها نحو يومان. This is a good example. ما رأيته مذ يومان. I have not seen him since 2 days. Now, how is i'rab of this done? ما رأيته منذ يو. When you have يومان in rafa coming after mudh or mundu. Okay. So they have different interpretations. Interpretation number 1, ما رأيته مذ يومان is in the power of ما رأيته بيني وبين لقائه يومان. Interpretation number 2, ما رأيته مذ يومان أي أمد انتفاء الرؤية يومان. Okay. So when we write ما رأيته مذ يومان, we can either understand مذ to be بيني وبين لقائي. Again, if it was مذ يومين, it's very simple, it's a jar majrur. But when it's not مذ يومين, we run into an issue. How do we understand the structure is مذ يومان? Why is يومان in rafa? Now we have to explain this somewhere. So, as the Zajjaj and Al-Akhfash say, mudh over here is in the power of bayni wa bayna liqa'i. And Abu Ali al-Farisi, he says, it's in the power of amadu intifa'i ru'yati yawman. Okay. According to Az-Zajjaj and Abu Ali's interpretation, both interpretations would refer to mudh yawman as a jumla ismiya. According to both of these interpretations, mudh yawman is becoming a jumla ismiya. The only difference is that in the first interpretation, that of Zajjaj, in that interpretation, mudh is serving as the khabar. and yawman is the mubtada. Why is mud serving as the khabar? Mud is serving as the khabar because it's in the power of bayni wa bayni liqa'i. And that's a zarf. Therefore, it will become the khabar. And yawman will serve as the mubtada. And according to Abu Ali al-Farisi's interpretation, amadun tifa'i ru'ya, because mud is in the meaning of amadun tifa'i ru'ya, well, that amadu is an ism. Therefore, we're going to make it the mubtada, and we'll make yawman the khabar. Okay. But al-Kisai, he says no. Him and a group, they say that ma ra'aytuhu mud yawman is really in the power of ma ra'aytuhu mundu mundu yawman is actually in the power of mundu kana yawman. I have not seen him since 2 days have passed. Okay, according to this, he says that mundu is connecting to ra'aytu on account of being a dharf, including the time. I have not seen him since, so mundu over here is connecting to ra'aytu. So it's all one big sentence. And then kana yawman, that entire structure as a whole is going to become the mudaf ilay. Alright, so we would write over here, we would say that الجملة في محل جر لأنها مضاف إليها. A third group, this is their third interpretation. Okay, now over here, according to this, just keep in mind this entire structure is one sentence. We don't actually have two sentences. According to the previous two structures, ما رأيته مذ يومان is in the power of ما رأيته, one sentence. Sentence 2 is بيني وبين لقائه يومان. Interpretation number 2, ما رأيته أمد انتفاء الرؤية يوما. Once again, we have two sentences, and according to both of these, they're reinterpreted as جملة اسمية. ما رأيته منذ كان يومان. In this scenario, كان يومان is a جملة فعلية, and the entire structure is actually one sentence. It's not two separate sentences. It's a small sentence playing a role in a bigger sentence. Okay, but the entire structure is actually one sentence. Okay, the fourth interpretation is ما رأيته من الزمن الذي هو يومان. Okay, and in this case over here, we'd say that منذ is a harful jar, and the الذي is in the meaning of ذو, which is an ism mawsul. Now this is a bit complicated, so we'll leave this. The purpose of the structure is to show that we can reinterpret with yawman based on how we interpret it. It can either be a jumla ismiya or it can be a jumla fi'liya, and this will be revisited later on bi'idhnillah. Okay, then you have the like of ماذا صنعت. What have you done? ماذا صنعت. This can be reinterpreted as ما الذي صنعته. ما الذي صنعته. Now, in this case, if you reinterpret ماذا صنعت as ما الذي صنعته, what is the ma becoming over here? In ما الذي صنعته, what have you done? In this case, we would say ma is the mubtada. الذي is the khabar, and صنعته is the صلة of الذي. الجملة في لا محل لها من الإعراب لأنها صلة للذي ولأنها صلة لاسم الموصول. But ما is the mubtada and الذي is the khabar. If you reinterpret ماذا صنعت as ما الذي صنعته, and in this scenario, this would be a jumla ismiya. But if we reinterpret this as ما الذي صنعت is in the power of أي شيء صنعته. ماذا, not ما الذي, sorry. ماذا is in the power of أي شيء. And that's just a مفعول به coming before the fi'l. And in this case, it should be reinterpreted as a jumla fi'liya. Alright, now let's move on. نعم الرجل زيد versus نعم الرجل زيد. Over here we have two possible i'rabs. Now, I want you to, based on your previous understanding of the two possible i'rabs over here, try determining how this would be reinterpreted, the entire structure as a jumla ismiya, or how would you make it two sentences, and then you have a fi'liya and an ismiya. Based on the previous i'rab, we've taught of this in our previous lessons on mutammima. Alright, the jumla can be either ismiya or it can be fi'liya. Now he says there's also another, in Mughni he mentions, you can also say a jumla can be a dharfiyya. How exactly is a jumla considered a dharfiyya? to understand this, later on, Ibn Hisham will do a very special i'rab of dharf mustaqar. When he does that i'rab, then you'll understand how a jumla can be dharfiyya. As of now, just put it to the side. But keep in your mind that it's possible for a jumla to be dharfiyya according to a specific i'rab, which we will teach to you later on, bi'idhnillah. Alright. Then he says, the jumla, just as it can break up into ismiyyah and fi'liyah, it can also break up into kubra and sughra. I'm missing some of the text over here. Now, he says, ثم الجملة تنقسم ثانيا إلى صغرى وكبرى. Alright, you can refer back to your editions of Qawaid al-I'rab. I actually don't have an edition on me, it's in the other room. But just read the actual text from there. And we'll also cover this actual text in the next lesson. The point is that this structure, the jumla, can either be a sughra or it can be a kubra. Now, how will you differentiate between this being a jumla and a kubra? The answer is very simple. If the sentence is playing a role in a bigger sentence, you label it as sughra. And if the sentence is not playing a role in a bigger sentence, meaning it's the larger sentence itself, then it will be called al-kubra. Okay? And you've come across many examples of this. The author himself will give you a few examples of this. He says, وَإِذَا قِيلَ, when it is said, زَيْدٌ أَبُوهُ غُلَامُهُ مُنْطَلِقٌ. Now, pause the video and try translating this. Okay, this is an interesting structure. زَيْدٌ أَبُوهُ غُلَامُهُ مُنْطَلِقٌ. How do you translate this structure? Afwan, there was no missing structure. It is Zaydun Abuhu. And this is the very next statement of Ibn Hisham. Nothing is missing. In the commentary, Al-Azhari writes ثُمَّ ينقسم إلى صغرى وكبرى. But the text of Ibn Hisham is وَإِذَا قِيلَ زَيْدٌ أَبُوهُ غُلَامُهُ مُنْطَلِقٌ. Alright. How do you make sense of this? What's the translation? Zayd, comma. His father, comma. His slave, i.e. the father's servant, muntaliq, is going. So the simple way of translating that in English would be Zayd's father's servant is going. Okay. Over here, فَزَيْدٌ مُبْتَدَأٌ أَوَّلٌ. Zayd is our first mubtada. You can look at the diagram we made over here. Zayd is our first mubtada. وَأَبُوهُ, the word abuhu is our second mubtada. وَغُلَامُهُ مُبْتَدَأٌ ثَالِث. The word غُلَامُهُ is our third mubtada. And then منطلق, this is the khabar of mubtada number 3. So it's khabar الثالث. ومنطلق, نعم. فزيد مبتدأ أول وأبوه مبتدأ ثاني وغلامه مبتدأ ثالث ومنطلق خبر الثالث. منطلق is becoming the khabar of غلامه. Then والثالث وخبره, the third mubtada along with its khabar, i.e. the sentence غلامه منطلق is khabar الثاني, the khabar of the second mubtada, i.e. أبوه. والثاني وخبره, and then the second mubtada, which is أبوه, and its khabar, which is the entire structure, غلامه منطلق, becomes خبر الأول, the khabar of the first mubtada. ويسمى المجموع جملة كبرى. The structure as a whole, زيد أبوه غلامه منطلق, is the jumla kubra. And then within that, غلامه منطلق is playing a role in a bigger sentence. Therefore, it is صغرى. وغلامه منطلق جملة صغرى. And then أبوه غلامه منطلق, this is what we call ذات الوجهين. It's playing two roles. On one hand, it's playing a role in the bigger structure, زيد أبوه غلامه منطلق. On the other hand, it itself has a smaller structure, غلامه منطلق, inside it. So we say وأبوه غلامه منطلق جملة كبرى بالنسبة إلى غلامه منطلق. In relation to the smaller structure, غلامه منطلق, it's جملة كبرى. But وصغرى بالنسبة إلى زيد, in relation to the earlier مبتدا, it is a جملة صغرى. Okay? Now, technically speaking, you shouldn't be saying صغرى al-kubra, you should be saying as-صغرى and al-kubra. Ibn Hisham himself mentions that, but that's not an issue. The point over here is that you're going to have bigger structures and sentences within bigger structures, and you've already come across many examples of this as you were studying over the last year. So this doesn't need to be mentioned in that much detail. The point is you're going to have sentences within sentences. The smaller sentence will be referred to as jumla sughra, and the larger sentence will be referred to as jumla kubra. ومثله لكننا هو الله ربي إذ أصله لكن أنا هو الله ربي وإلا لقيل لكنه. This is a very good example mentioned by Ibn Hisham. And we'll cover this and we'll conclude with this bi'idhnillah. Now let's understand this. Okay. Lakinna huwa Allahu Rabbi. In fact, pause the video and try doing i'rab. And he's giving you a hint. Asluhu lakin ana huwa Allahu Rabbi. How do we do i'rab of the structure? How do we understand the structure? Again, we have sentences within sentences. And after doing i'rab, translate as well. The correct translation is, however, as for me, Allah is my Lord. Okay? Naam. As for me, Allah is my Lord. This is the story of the two people discussing the garden, which is mentioned in Surah Al-Kahf. And the good man says to the wretched man that, as for me, Allah is my Lord, and I don't associate any partners with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I will trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and wealth does not mean much in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Naam. Lakin ana huwa Allahu Rabbi. Now over here, this structure, what we have before us in our recitation is lakinna huwa Allahu Rabbi. How do we understand this structure? If you say lakinna is a harf mushabbah bil fi'l, right? مثقلة. مثقلة means it has a tashdid, it retains a tashdid. And huwa is the ism of lakinna. You run into an issue. What's the issue? There's an alif in between. Okay, well, pronunciation reasons, let's assume we can add the alif. Still, you run into an issue. If you have an ism of lakinna or inna, etc., coming right after it as a pronoun, what happens? You cannot say lakinna huwa. You're forced to bring the ism of lakinna as a dhamir muttasil. We can't say this first huwa over here is the ism of lakinna, right? Because if that was the case, we couldn't say, we would be forced to say lakinnahu. But the structure is not lakinnahu, it's lakinna huwa. And then there's an alif in there. What's that alif there for? So now how do we understand this? So he says, in reality, we have three mubtadas over here. Lakin, but, ana, huwa, this huwa is a dhamir al-sha'an. The matter of the fact is like, قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدٌ. Right? Similar to that. And that will obviously serve as a mubtada. Allahu Rabbi. He says the correct way of doing i'rab over here is to understand, number one, what's the asl? What is the base? The base was, the actual structure was, lakin, ana, huwa Allahu, or huwa Allahu Rabbi. Now, how do we understand the structure? He says, look, we had lakin and we had ana. The haraka of the hamza of lakin was given to the previous letter. Lakin essentially had a sukoon. Okay. And then the haraka of the hamza was given to the previous letter. When the haraka of hamza was given to the previous letter, we dropped the hamza. Now, after dropping the hamza, we have an issue because we have two letters back to back, which are the exact same letters, and they both have a haraka. So what do? We make the first sakin, and we do idgham. So hence, lakin ana became lakina, and then na with the hamza in between. You drop the hamza, not really hamza, but an alif in between. We drop the alif. Became lakina na. We have two letters back to back, exact same letters. They both have harakat, but we can do idgham. Make the first letter into a sakin, lakin na, and then do idgham. Hence, we have lakinna huwa Allahu Rabbi. This is the actual structure. Okay. And accordingly, the i'rab of this will be lakin ana. This ana, the person saying ana is the very person saying Rabbi. Right? Allah is my Lord. That person is the very same person saying ana. That's why this is ask for me. Ask for me. We can't say I, comma, he, comma, Allah is my Lord. Because in English, this doesn't really work too well. And this he, to be honest, isn't even in the meaning of he. The huwa is a dhamir al-sha'an. Right? قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدٌ is not translated to say he. Allah is the one. If you take huwa to be a dhamir al-sha'an. If you take huwa to be something else, then that's a different scenario. Now over here, the huwa is a dhamir al-sha'an. And since that's the case, we would say that the huwa is actually becoming a mubtada itself. But we have a very simple or very similar example to our previous example. We have three mubtadas back to back. Ana, huwa, Allah. Ana is mubtada'un awwal. Huwa is mubtada'un thani. Lafdul jalala is mubtada'un thalith. And then Rabbi is becoming the khabar of lafdul jalala. So therefore, khabarun mubtada thalith. And that structure as an entire, alright, the jumla is becoming the khabar of lil mubtada'i الثاني, which is the dhamir al-sha'an. And then that structure as an entire is becoming the khabar of ana, which is the first mubtada. And therefore, once again, according to Ibn Hisham's understanding, you would say over here that, let's see if you written it out. We have not written it out, so we'll write it for you. Ana huwa Allahu Rabbi as a whole is a jumla kubra, or al-jumla al-kubra. And then Allahu Rabbi, that structure alone would be sughra. And then huwa Allahu Rabbi, the middle structure, would be dhatul wajhain. It is kubra from a perspective. So it's kubra from the perspective of the structure it includes, and it's sughra from the perspective of the larger sentence which it is becoming a part of. Lakin ana huwa Allahu Rabbi. As for me, Allah is my Lord. The matter of the fact is, or the fact of the matter, sorry, is that Allah is my Lord. Okay. Now, why can't we say it's lakinnahu? To say lakin is ism, is a harf mushabba bil fi'l, and the huwa is the ism of lakinna. You can't do that because had that been the case, you'd be forced to say lakinnahu. Okay, and you're not saying lakinnahu clearly, and therefore you cannot make that assumption. All right. Now, certain scenarios, you'll find certain scenarios where it's possible. It is possible for you to identify a sentence and treat it as a sughra within a kubra or not. So let's take an example of this. أنا آتيك به قبل أن تقوم من مقامك. Right? أنا آتيك به. قبل أن تقوم من مقامك. Now, in this structure over here, this atika, is that a fi'l mudari or is it an ismul fa'il? Now, i'rab wise, there'd be a big difference, right? Because if we say this is a fi'l mudari, we would say that this entire structure as a whole, all right, is fi mahalli raf'in khabarun li ana. And then according to that, this entire structure as a whole would actually be a jumla sughra. But if we say atika is not a fi'l mudari, atika itself is actually becoming an ismul fa'il, then in that scenario, atika bihi, the entire structure is not the khabar as a whole of ana. Rather, ati itself, that ismul fa'il, is the khabar of ana. And the rafa is assumed upon ati. The ismul fa'il itself is the khabar of ana, and then the kaf is a mudaf ilay, and then the bihi is connecting to ati on account of ati being an ismul fa'il governing like a verb. So this would not be an example of a jumla sughra within a jumla kubra. It would be an example of the khabar of ana being a mufrad. Why is this important? I'm mentioning this over here because from here you understand the difference between the i'rab method and the tarkib method. If you were doing tarkib over here, which is taught in many institutions, and it's not an issue to teach this in the beginning, if it makes things easier for students, that's fine. But if you were doing tarkib over here, you would say atika bihi is the khabar, and then you would say ati breaks up into an ismul fa'il, and then the kaf is the mudaf ilay, and then the bihi is a majrur. And were we to assume this to be a verb, once again you would say ana atika bihi. Atika bihi as a whole is the khabar, and then that breaks up into a fi'l mudari followed by the maf'ul bin al-muta'alliq. Now the second method, how do we assume atika to be a fi'l? It would technically be correct. But the issue in this is that when you do the exact same breakdown for the ismul fa'il, you see the entire structure as a whole, right? Ismul fa'il connecting with this mudaf ilay, connecting with this jar majrur muta'alliq becomes the khabar. That's actually incorrect. Why is that incorrect? Because in ana atika bi, when we consider atika bi to be a fi'l, over there the entire sentence as a whole is truly becoming the khabar of ana. But if you consider atik to be an ismul fa'il, then in that scenario, the sentence as a whole is not becoming khabar of ana. Ati alone is becoming khabar of ana. And in this case, we don't have a sughra, a jumla sughra, becoming the khabar of the kubra. We simply have a mufrad becoming the khabar of ana. And based on this, you can understand that in certain scenarios, if you were to use the tarkib method, it would lead to a faulty understanding of i'rab, as mentioned in the books of the grammarians. So for this reason, the i'rab method is given preference, essentially especially when it comes to looking into actual books of tafsir and i'rab. And that's why whenever you look into books of tafsir and i'rab, they always have the i'rab method. But for beginners, there's nothing wrong with mentioning the tarkib method to make things easier to understand, and for instance to join A and B together or to create boxes, etc. That's not an issue for beginners. But at a certain level, the student needs to grow out of that and actually understand the i'rab method, so he's able to access books of tafsir and i'rab. Okay, so over here, if we take ati to be a fi'l mudari, then we have a jumla في محل رفع خبر أنا, right? And that would mean that we have a kubra and a sughra. But if we say ati is normally it's just an ism al-fa'il, it's mudaf to its maf'ul bihi, then in that scenario we would say that ati itself is the khabar of ana, and there's no scenario of kubra and sughra over here. It's just one sentence, all right? And that second explanation of ism al-fa'il mudaf to its maf'ul bihi is actually what occurs in وَإِنَّهُمْ آتِيهِمْ عَذَابٌ غَيْرُ مَرْدُودٍ. Unlike what it occurs in وَكُلُّهُمْ آتِيهِ يَوْمَ الْقِيَامَةِ فَرْدًا. Okay, in those structures over there. This is where Simin al-Halabi, the author of الدر المصون, he says أنا آتيك يجوز أن يكون فعلا مضارعا فوزنه أفعل أي أضرب، والأصل أأتيك بهمزتين فأبدلت الثانية ألفا, hence it became آتيك. ويجوز, and likewise it's also permissible أن يكون اسم فاعل, for it to be an اسم فاعل, وزنه فاعل, alright, آتيك, right, والألف زائدة, the second alif in آتيك is extra, والهمزة أصلية, the hamza at the beginning is the root letter from أتى يأتي آتي, عكس الأول is not extra. وأمال حمزة آتيك في الموضعين. And we'll stop over here بإذن الله, and we'll continue on with our next lesson. والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.